and then Pauline Johnson. Okay.
We are a family, a big family.
And today we're going to have the best discussion of the entire week. And so this evening we have with us Father Matthew Ragbier, who is the spiritual director and theological advisor of the Archdiocese and Family Life Commission. Also, we have Mr. and Mrs. Down from Arima, Kevin and Annette Downs. We have Mrs. Tanya Gooding and Mr. Jerome Alexander. I am Mrs. Pauline Phelps. I'm the coordinator for the Billings Method Association, and I am here to moderate for this particular discussion on sex education. So without further ado, let's get straight into this discussion. And Father Matthew, you with us? Yes?
Yes. Hi, everyone. And so I'm just going to share screen and begin. So sex education, one writer says, whoever controls the youth owns the future, controls the future. And as we think about sex education, there's a lot at stake for us to reflect on, okay? That's the first thing for us to realize. And parents, I hope you're hearing this and taking this to heart. It takes a long time to build a house, Kubi says. But you know what? Just a couple of hours to burn it down. We can do a lot of work on formation, and it just takes some simple things sometimes, and sometimes they're very well coordinated, but it could really throw things off course. And so we have to be aware of all of this as we enter. A very beautiful quote for us to place the context of integrated desire, which is what chastity is about. And as we think about this, think about the realities around us. The best instance of human male, for example, we could say of a human female, is not a glorified walk-in packet of urges. So this is what Bushevsky says. And, think about what we see around us, what we hear about people's lives, what we know in our own life, and what we see on television, on our music, etc. Do we see more of walk-in packets of urges or something else? But the best instance is really that person who, for the sake of the highest and greatest goods, commands themselves. That's self-mastery. Strengthens their brothers and sisters and defends their brothers and sisters, regarding even the meanest of men or women as a lady or gentleman. In other words, it's someone who is not impulsive, has self-mastery, has a sense of who they are, self-control. All of this is part and parcel of sex education, which is looking at how do we integrate desire? How do we integrate desire? Okay. One last quote from the Holy Father. Of course, we have to quote from Pope Francis. It is one thing to understand how fragile and bewildered young people can be, but it's another thing to encourage them in this prolonged immaturity in the way they show love. And, more and more, you find psychologists and sociologists reminding us that we have this prolonged adolescent period. Plotkin is one of those who writes, and he speaks about we're preoccupied with comforts and entertainment and self-identity and attaining status symbols, which are all the preoccupations of adolescence. So we're looking at growing up. Our version, our understanding of this is growing up. And we're going to see very shortly what is being passed on and by whom. Because there are ways in which the world and secular world, the UNFPA, IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Foundation, and other groups are presenting sex education that we say, that's not what we want. That is not what we want, okay? Let's think about a human person and about the milieu that we find ourselves in, okay? What civilizes us? What is there around us that pertains to human culture? That what humanizes us is another way in which that can be said, in the thinking of Pope John Paul II. He wrote a lot about this. And therefore, what is teaching us to be human? First of all, you have the social media influencers. TikTok is a big thing. So there you see TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, Snapchat, Twitter, all these things. You have Netflix, Disney, and all the other things that people watch and that we are all, it's all around us in the culture. You have the influencers who are part and parcel of the social media and in sport and etc. You have like Kylie Jenner, you have Cristiano Ronaldo there, you have The Rock, Ariana Grande. You have the movies that we are looking at. Okay, Never Have I Ever is trending in the top 10. Things like that. You have the gender ideology and the way that is infiltrated everywhere. You have the music we're listening to. The music is sending a message. You could take any of our songs from any genre, You have calypso, conscious, soca, in reggae, rap, all sorts of things. What are the messages and what is it doing to us? Because it's educating us in some way. And we have to see, well, is this something we want or is it something we don't want? And as we try to form and fashion our children, and as we look at what is best for us, what is good for us, we have to be aware of what's in the soil as well. When you put in fertilizer, they tell you, well, that plant can't really grow in that soil. You have plenty of things to take out of that soil. You have weeds in that soil. We have to look and see what's in that soil and how is it affecting us. So for the UN and for the International Planned Parenthood Foundation, they speak about sex education, and they speak about what they do as in comprehensive sex education as a commitment to promoting and protecting and upholding the sexual and reproductive health rights of all young people. Now, take note of that. What a weird way to state that. This includes a right to information and education on sexuality, a right to pleasure. Wow, okay, look at that. Sounds very hedonistic. And confidence in relationships and all aspects of their sexuality. Information should be available to children and young people of all ages. Wow, and we're going to see how they literally mean from all ages. In their categorization, they have 0 to 4 as one of those age groups. Broad-based strategies are needed to address young people both in and out of school. Some of the key points that all these versions of comprehensive sex education speak of: the journey towards a complete removal of moral limits to sexuality, because they see this as oppressive. In fact, the word that they often use is a Freudian term that is repressive. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. They speak about what you feel, that's who you are. And that's very much part of the gender ideology. The destruction of any sense of shame. And there is a healthy shame, by the way, that is part and parcel of a child growing up, okay? Activation of sexual urges from early childhood. They speak about this. The obstruction of the conscience. The exaltation of consensual, that should be consensual pleasure. Self-control and modesty are seen as repressive. Again, freedom indifferent to what is chosen, and undermining the rights of parents to raise their children as they see fit. In fact, Monica Klein was speaking recently on July 10th, the Iowa state, they rejected the funding that was given to certain Planned Parenthood sex education programs. And she was speaking, and she was someone who was trained in this, and she's speaking and has left that and said that these programs are actually created to teach children about sexuality in order for them to become sexually active. Okay? That's from someone who was inside working with. Let's look one example. This is really shocking, but the Standards for Sexuality Education in Europe that was published by the World Health Organization and the German Federal Center for Health Education in 2010 speaks of children having, between 0 to 4 years old, the right to explore nakedness and the body and gender identities. 0 to 4 years old. I took off the other things because they border on really what is not good for us. Age 4 to 6, talk about sexual matters and sexual language. The child should be given information about enjoyment and pleasure when touching one's own body, friendship and love towards people of the same sex, secret love, and first love, and an awareness of their rights. Very, very frightening reality when we see, okay, what's the reality of what is being proposed as sex education out there? What's that reality like? Okay, and what we do know is that the church has something to say about this, because for us, this is not formation. This was what we just saw is an indoctrination. So we have to ask, what is the formation in human sexuality about? Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and we could take a few minutes and then jump back into looking at that.
Well, let's ask Tanya. Tanya, what has been done so far, thus far, when it comes to educating young people in human sexuality?
Okay, so for those who don't know me, my name is Tanya Gooding, and I'm the president of NGO Communities Alive Education and Training. And we're responsible for a program called Alive to the World. At present, we have partnered with the Catholic Education Board, and our program is running in several Roman Catholic primary schools with a view to being in all schools. So the program itself, Alive to the World, is founded on virtues, right? So the essence of it is virtues and character education with an emphasis on healthy sexuality, because the understanding of our definition of sex education is everything a human person ought to know to be involved in a healthy relationship and engender them into being a happily married couple. So when you really think of what that means, you think of commitment, you think of self-sacrifice, you think of good communication, you think of generosity, you think of fundamental virtues that each human being needs to develop in order firstly to be friends and then to develop into relationships. And it's crucial that these are the areas we addressed primarily in the younger ages. It's all about developing the virtues or the good habits to be able to have healthy relationships, as well as at the same time develop the characteristics like self-control, self-discipline that are required to actually develop into the best version of you being a female, best version of you being a male, to come together to form a happily married couple. So that is where we place the emphasis, especially at primary school. And the introduction really into sexuality does begin in primary school. But guess what? It begins with genetics. We're born XX and XY chromosomes, male and female. So that is how it begins. And then, of course, we encourage parents to do their part in talking about the nitty-gritties and all the more, how should I put it, the more related to emotions, the more related to the development in puberty. And we suggest a book called Sexuality Explained, but of course there are many other books as well as resources to help you talk to your children about their personal development and further education in sexuality through puberty. Okay, so that is more or less where we start. And I know I'll have a chance to say it again, but anybody who's listening, there's our website is www.caettt.com, and we have there a whole wealth of resource material that any parents could log on to have these discussions with your children to get resources to help you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tanya. And with us this evening as well is Mr. Jerome Alexander, who has been in the work as well as bringing to our young people the truth about human sexuality and bringing it in a light that is very profound, in that it reaches the young people, especially the young men, who have been taught so many lies when it comes to the area of sexuality. Jerome, welcome. Please introduce yourself. Let's get you unmuted there.
You guys can hear me clearly now?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pauline, and good afternoon to everyone on the call and those that are viewing at home. My name, as Pauline mentioned, is Jerome Alexander. I am part of a non-profit organization that's based in the United States that's called Fight the New Drug. I work alongside the Family Life Commission here in Trinidad and Tobago. And basically, our main goal is to raise the awareness of the harmful effects of pornography. And this plays a huge role in today's society, the awareness. And I love what Tanya's group and organization is doing, because if we look at reference to what Pope Francis wrote in his exhortation, and I want to just clarify the word exhortation. And exhortation is a message, it's a communication that emphatically urges someone to do something. And in that, he speaks about the need for sexual education. And I think right now there's a mindset in the culture that sex education is something that you don't speak about until you're much older. And unfortunately, that has caused a lot of problems in society today. You don't need to look far to see the negative effects of that. So it starts at home. And as we are celebrating and shedding light on family and marriage, this is where the foundation for sexual education begins at home, and then it expands from there. We are just here to just add tools, resources to assist parents and to assist young adults, teenagers, and children along there to discovering the healthy way of discovering their own sexuality.
And so Father gave us quite a bit of information at the beginning of what human sexuality is supposed to be like, and yet what it is with regards to comprehensive sexuality education. And with us this evening is also Annette and Kevin Downs. I want to ask Annette and Kevin, what are your thoughts on that that part of the presentation that Father gave us there on comprehensive sexuality education? Did it shock you? Did it surprise you? What were your thoughts when you heard of young people touching themselves and so forth as being something that is encouraged?
Yes, so as Pauline said, my name is Kevin Downs, my wife Annette. So we are from the Santa Rosa Parish. We've been married for just about 22 years. And we have 2 children. I mean, they're 18 and 20 years old right now. But we're also part of the Joyful Marriage Preparation Program that is being run through the Archdiocese, and we're part of the team in Santa Rosa. So hearing what Father shared with regards to what was kind of important as sex education, it was a bit shocking initially, so much so that I would use the word diabolical, right? Because it really seems to be a structured approach to really break down the whole moral fiber of society through something that God intended to be very good, right? And shared within the context of the marital union, right? So, and it's key and obvious that, we need to really start taking the reins with regards to how we educate our children and our young people and even our adults, right, around sex education and what the church is really offering to us. Anything?
Yeah, what resonated for me is that the part where we have to, as parents, we need to be aware of what our children actually looking at, exposing themselves to, and really understand where they are, and we work with them, So we have a pivotal role in how they develop, and as Tonya mentioned, how do they reach to the stage of having a really good, successful marriage? So I think that was really a highlight for me. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Father, you had a little bit more to share with us?
Yes. So thank you very much, everyone, for your sharing and for the work that each and every person does in their own spheres. That's very important in putting forward another message, another option. As Tonya said, Alive to the World is there. As Jerome said, there is Fight the New Job movement that is also working towards human sexual formation and through self-mastery in the area of pornography. I'm getting an echo, so I'm not sure if someone's mic is echoing, but I'm getting an echo. Okay. So for the church, this is not just about providing information. there is information to be provided, but there's so much more than that. As Tony used the word virtue, and virtue comes from that sense of excellence in action. How do we train people in excellence in action? And we know that's caught before it's taught, is what you see around you. And we're going to get into that after this section a little bit more. But it's a bigger question around human flourishing and human development. Who are we called to be and to become as children of God? More appropriately, therefore, sex education is spoken of as virtue formation, affective development, the education or the learning to love, the maturation in love, in self-giving, formation in chastity. Those are terms that you see interchange in the many documents that the church has that speaks about sex education. Okay? Pope Francis writes, sex education also allows the sexual urge, in the way in which we speak about it, to be directed through a process of growth in self-knowledge and self-control. Self-knowledge and self-control. Okay, that's very important. So it has to be expanded to understand self-knowledge, self-control, the gift of self, capable of nurturing valuable capacities for joy and for the loving encounter. Hence, the church calls for positive and prudent sex education. It has to be, wisdom needs to be a part and parcel of that, to be imparted to children and adolescents as they grow older. It has to be developmental, with due weight being given to the advances in psychological, pedagogical, and didactic sciences. As part of human development, sex education needs to be appropriated to developmental stages of the persons and requires time. Okay, there is something called over-sexualizing. There is something called a hyper-sexualized society. There are things that we can do that is focusing only on the genitals, for instance. And sexuality is much more than that. It's much, much more than that. That's one aspect. That's genital sexuality. It includes what it means to be male or female, and therefore primary sense of sexuality, and the affective dimension, or passions, desires, the way in which our human will works in the midst of that. There's a lot more to sexuality. The church also speaks about, as I just said, it's more than genitals, So therefore, it's not an apprenticeship in techniques for personal satisfaction in their sexuality or pleasure. What is that called? That's called hedonism. That's called hedonism. And it actually leaves people very broken. One writer speaks about erotic scar tissue in our world being everywhere. It leaves people broken and disillusioned. Is love possible? Is love possible? And the answer is yes. It also requires a media literacy as we navigate, and Sister Angeline was talking about this yesterday. All the messages that are coming in, how are we critiquing them? How are we saying, this is what I believe and accept, this is what I don't? I have a question about this. Who's teaching our youth and our families, not just our youth? Who is teaching people to think critically about, are we just receiving everything, or are we analyzing with the truth of the gospel? Okay? So who teaches sex education? And as has been said already, parents have the inalienable right and duty to educate their children in sexuality. That's the first thing. When others, and the others means the schools. So what has happened as we empty families of the institution that it is over the last 50, 60 years, more and more the state takes on things, the welfare state takes on things that were in the ambit of family life. And when that happens, schools then and the state begins to do sex education and a whole set of other things. But it's rightfully in the area of family life. It's families. So when others, and for the church, they can assist, it must be done in the same spirit that animates the parents. Parents have to have that sense of, okay, we know what we would like for our families. Okay? So what informs parents? Every child is unique and irreplaceable. A person. And a person is more than the sum of their parts. A person is, we have to understand what that means. They're someone, they're not something. They're not a problem. And they ought to receive an individualized formation, attending to their needs and their developmental level and their understanding, their challenges, what's going on in their hearts and their mind, what's going on in their body. The moral dimension must always be part of explanations. And this is not about whether it's right or wrong. This is more than that. when we go right or wrong, or where we draw the line, we're entering into legalistic games. That's the games of the Pharisees who asked Jesus, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And Jesus took them beyond that to the question of what is good for us. And the vision God has. In the beginning, it was not so. So the moral dimension is about what is really good for us. And we've had what is called the eclipse of the good. We no longer look at what is really good for us. Because everybody thinks, well, what is good for me is what I decide, and what good for Jerome is what he decides, what good for Tony is. But that's not true. There's something that's good for us because we have a nature. So the moral dimension is important. Chastity education and opportune information about human sexuality must be offered in the widest context of education and human love. And parents must provide information on sexuality with extreme delicacy, but nonetheless in a clear way and at an opportune time. All this is very important. So therefore, the approach is interdisciplinary, as we've seen, because sexuality is part and parcel of who we are. It's not a separate component. We are, as it were, sex, male or female. And this identity is beyond the many changing desires and feelings we may have. It's part and parcel of the many dimensions. And the church speaks about this in the Catechism. It affects all the aspects of the human person in the unity of his body and soul. Okay? The human beings have a human nature. I just made reference to that in terms of the moral aspect. And therefore, there's something that's good for us. It's a deep structure of who we are. And what is happening is the world we live in is saying, no, nature is something that is imposing on us, and we have to be able to be whatever we want. But to do that is to stop being human. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is human? We have to also understand that when we engage in sexual in virtue formation, sexual education, all these things, that it's about using our freedom for our flourishing in the midst of many desires, in the midst of many options, in the midst of all that's there before us. How do we choose and understand that my choices does carve a pathway that changes me? And real freedom is not, therefore, being able to do what I want, when I want, how I want. It affects me. It affects other people because we're social as well. Therefore, we have to learn how to order our lower parts, and by that, this is getting a bit into ethics, and our appetites and desires to the higher parts, to our reason, beauty, goodness, truth of who we are for our growth and development. So that we don't say, okay, you know what? I'm not advertising any fast food here, but let's say a particular fast food that people have been longing to eat for the longest while has just reopened on Monday, and we just want to eat 3 big buckets full of, will you sit all night and eat it because your appetite, your hunger for this is so great? And think about that in sexuality. Or do we use our reason to order that appetite and say, what is best for me now? I may have 1 piece, I may have 2 pieces, but I have to manage those desires. And that's the ordering process. And we're going to come to our desires right after the sharing around this. We have to learn to accept our bodies. We're embodied spirits. We're not just bodies, and neither are we just spirits. We are actually embodied spirits. And that's an important thing. It affects a lot of how we understand ourselves. Also, we have to, Pope Francis says this, avoid the pretension to cancel out sexual difference. There's beauty in difference. Don't just say diversity. It's not many shades of one thing. There's beauty in difference. There's beauty in the male and the female. Also, this is important because parents also sometimes could give the false impression that sex is something shameful or dirty. And therefore, there are many Christians walking around with actual heresies in the way in which they understand sexuality. Heresies, thinking, body evil, soul good, and all sorts of things, something, a kind of angelism sort of thing. But no, it's a gift from God. Our body's a gift from God. And we are in flesh beings. So it is a gift from God who placed the ability to generate life in the human body, thereby sharing his creative power with us. Therefore, we have to learn to see the other person as someone, not something. We have to learn that love is more important than sex. And it's just, sex has been just reduced a biological mechanism of just, seeking pleasure. And there's so much more when we empty sex of love. That's what happens. Love requires a giving of the gift of self, receiving of the other's gift in a way that's free and complete and faithful and fruitful. For the promises sex makes are not well kept in casual encounters. That's what we have to teach our children. How do we promise? How do we commit? How do we give ourselves? And that begins in the little things we do at home. Giving myself, investing, caring, looking out for each other. Everybody helping to commit to make the family a better space and a home to live in. These promises need a home, a protected place in which to grow. And therefore, the promises sex makes, that home is marriage and the commitment of marriage. That's what that says there. And therefore, there's a meaning to sex and sexuality. It's not arbitrary. One of those, as Tanya said, is procreation, the bringing about and nurturing of new life, the formation of families in which children have moms and dads. And then the other is union, the mutual and total self-giving, accepting of the two polar complementary selves in the entirety, soul and body. In the entirety, soul and body. Lastly, there's a cultivation of chastity that is very, very important. And therefore, we have to learn how to develop chastity, integrated desire. You know, one of the things the church says is that we cannot give what we don't possess, and we have to possess ourselves in order to give ourselves. And how do we do that? Through the virtue of chastity, in a concrete way, self-possession, which makes us free from selfishness and aggression and holding back. To the degree that a person weakens chastity, his or her love, the church says, becomes more and more selfish. That is, a satisfying a desire for pleasure and no longer self-giving. So there's a quick summary about, you know, the kind of like the nuts and, well, a broad stroke, sorry, around sexual development. We're going to have a little discussion, and then when we come back, the last part will be looking at, for children, some of the actual baby steps in everyday life at home we need to do to cultivate virtue, sexual formation, human formation, flourishing.
Okay, thank you, Father. Thank you for that. And so we understand that, you know, sexuality is definitely more than just talking about the body and genitals and so forth, right? But it has been boiled down to that in many, many instances, unfortunately. And what we need to do is to bring it back, yes, into a conversation. And it often starts with the parents, yes, and it should. It should. Unfortunately, as we know, as Father put the first part of the presentation, we know that it happens amongst young people after they watch Netflix or after they watch, you know, something else on television or a movie or whatever. They may have that conversation or no conversation, have that exploration. So let's get back to Tanya now. And Tanya, how does your Life to the World program recognize, or how does it deal with young people's exposure to, you know, these other sources from the outside? Does it do that?
Yeah. Okay. So what I should have mentioned is that I'm here today as both an educator and a parent. So what I learned from my program, I try to implement in my home. Now, my children range from 22 all the way down to 6. So I have many opportunities to delve in many different aspects of sexuality. So one thing that Father mentioned that I wanted to bring in early was critical thinking and the ability to discern. A Life to the World presents that in how we use our narrative format in our storytelling. So each chapter is addressed in the form of a story. What that enables a facilitator within a classroom to do is to have a concept, and through somebody else's story, children are able to enter into it. And then through discussion, healthy discussion afterwards, drawing out from them, what would you feel if you're in that situation, what would you do and why? That kind of questioning provokes critical thinking. It's not telling them what to do. And this is how children actually absorb virtues and make intelligent choices. So when you take that in the classroom, using that power of discernment and bring it into your home, after a movie, a parent will now sit and say, okay, so what did you get out of that movie? What would you have done if you were in that situation? Why would you have done that? And that is the way we as parents are able to help our children think critically, make wise decisions. And of course, if they are answering in a specific direction, you can offer your perspective. You don't have to force it down their throats, depending on the age, right? But again, you would say, if that is the position you're taking, if the person did something wrong and somebody was hurt, how would you feel if you were the person who was hurt? If you didn't, look at it from that perspective. And that relates to your sexuality, that relates to relationships, that relates to life. So again, that method of discernment, trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, looking at the overall concept, that is the kind of pedagogy that Alive to the World uses, and then we encourage parents to adopt that same strategy within their homes. I also wanted to mention something else the father spoke about in terms of approaching the understanding of love. It's very well orchestrated, and every time I've spoken to other parents about it, because Alive to also comes with training, and that is something that people tend to forget, that in order to facilitate a program like this, you need to have a good understanding of a bit of philosophy, anthropology, a little bit of psychology, and how the person works, affectivity and sexuality. It's a broad range of knowledge that needs to be imparted in a specific way for the children to be able to absorb, understand, appreciate, and put into practice. And the 3 levels of love is something that, I don't know, many people don't see it, don't know about it, don't think about it, but there are 3 levels of a human person that operate in integration. And the basic level is physical, then psychological, then intellectual. And we first experience love normally by attraction or lust, but it's at the physical level. Then you fall in love. So we're talking about as you get older. And then love, true love, is a decision of the will. Decision to will the good of the other. And that is what I think many people, if they don't know what it is, they don't know what they're striving for or looking for. So again, many of these key messages are encapsulated within the Alive to the World program. But again, every parent needs to be able to understand what they're trying to impart, why they're trying to impart it, and of course the overall goal and objective. You're trying to bring up adults within the culture. I sometimes call it toxic, yes, toxic culture we're living in. We need to help them choose from as early as possible what we're watching at home, why we're watching it, and why we're choosing to be different. I know some of the things you mentioned that I've never heard about, but I'm sure all the children do know based on their freedom as they get older. But within our context, what we're trying to teach our children, yes, is about everything related to becoming the best version of themselves as they get older. I think that's it. What I want to touch on now. Thanks.
Thanks, Tanya. And I want to ask Kevin and Anna to chime in at this point. As parents, what were your feelings when you had to have a discussion? Was it one discussion? Was it several discussions with your children?
Yeah. So for me, our daughter, she's 20, and she was the first one actually I started to talk to from very early, because they were exposed to the school-based sex education in the primary school, and by doing biology and stuff like that. But I often I started to talk to her about it, and I realized that they know a whole lot, right? What they didn't know and they were missing is that the spiritual side of it, what it meant and how to link that. So it was important for us. And I would often go to Kevin, even before I go to her, say, how do we explain this? What do we say to questions like these, And he would normally have the answer. But most times with the daughter, you'll find I will have to go to her and talk to her about those things. He will have to go to the son. And we kind of share among ourselves. But one of these key things I think for us that we needed to do as a first step is to teach them more about love and about that self-giving, and Father mentioned it in his one of his points there, that self-giving, we have to practice that even among us first before we could even go out there and even find love, because what you don't want is for them to have to experience it outside first. So we knew that we spoke about that, Kevin and I spoke about it very early when they were born, and we said, we don't want them to have to figure this out, or somebody come and tell them something from the outside. That was critical for us, and I think we tried to do that. And then when the sexual honesty and all of that started to come into being, we started to explain to them, this is so important, and what would Jesus do in a situation like that? So we try to have that discussion, but we try to make sure we're on the same page before we message it to them.
Yeah, and I think it's really key and very heartening for me to hear the work that is being done with Tonya in terms of educating parents around how they need to approach these situations. I mean, for us, it was basically like, all right, but I don't want my children learning stuff like that on the outside, so I need to let them know what is happening from our perspective on the inside. So if you can't shield them from what is going to be happening on the outside, but at least they're going to have some bit of a foundation that is going to be somewhat counter to what may be happening on the outside.
Yes, it's important to connect the two, the outside, what's happening outside, and what's happening here in your own home. So, Jerome, tell us a little bit more about your program, well, the program that you share with in schools and so forth, the Fight the New Drug. What aspects of the talk, and especially parents, how do you bring in that aspect? Meaning, okay, you're talking about human sexuality, but are you connecting the parents to the children in your discussions?
Absolutely. I think they work hand in hand. And what I have seen from presenting all these years is that there is a huge need, I would say, for healthy, as Pope Francis put, positive but prudent sexual education. And I'm just speaking from my personal experience. Growing up, I'm 35 years old now, and I have never had a conversation with my parents about sexual education. And I would go so far as saying there was one time that I had the opportunity to speak to a secondary school, a group of Form 4s. It was roughly about 78, could be 79 young men. And I asked the question, how many of you guys were told by your parents about what healthy sexuality is? And of those 79 young men, one raised his hand, right? So that just shows that there's a lot of need, there's a huge need for education behind this. One of the things that stood out to me that Father mentioned was that, we want to show children that in marriage, in a relationship, to see the other person as someone and not something. And I remember one of the studies that was done, they took a group of individuals that were looking at pornography, and they wanted to see what was happening in their brain while they were looking at it. And they noticed that the parts of the brain, the area of the brain that lit up the most, was the part that we identify with an object. And what that means when translated is that individuals now, after looking at pornography for however long, they now tend to see their partner, their spouse, another person of the opposite sex, or even of the same sex, as an object rather than a person to be loved, a person to be cared for. They now see them as something to be used. And we're seeing the effects of this in society. And so it is critical. And I understand, and I've said this before, that as a parent, the light switch is never turned off for you to teach. There's always an opportunity for you to teach. And as a result, my heart goes out to parents because there's so much that they have to do. There's single parents. I mean, both parents are working. It's sometimes difficult to sit down and find that opportunity to speak with your son or your daughter about it. But we see in today's world, the youth are bombarded constantly with image of sexuality. It's hypersexualized. Just today, I passed by this brand new car wash, and there's this big poster with 3, I would say almost half naked women on a car. And these are the subliminal messages that are happening. You know, you talked earlier on about Netflix and YouTube, and these social media platforms are loaded with a lot of sexual content. And if there is no one there to guide the youths, to let them know what is healthy, what is not healthy, what they should expect, what they should not do, we have a huge problem. So this is where, you know, the platform that we are creating comes in to fill that gap, to give to parents, you know, that resource of showing them, you know, how to go about talking about this. Because the whole issue of, I mean, you just mentioned sexual education, and there's a sort of awkwardness that comes with it, right? And how do we break down that barrier? How do we begin to share little nuggets, little step-by-step, you know, tips to really begin the conversation that is something year-long, lifelong, really, to help the youths, you know, understand what do they do with all of these urges as opposed to what the world is selling that you should do with it.
Thanks, Jerome. So, Father, let's take it back to you.
Okay, so, you know, this is a big question. How then do we help persons interpret the meaning of the many experiences and desires and integrate them? Because that's what people are saying. I'm experiencing all these things are being thrown at me. How do I interpret and integrate? Okay, now there's much more to be said about this. This is just really touching the surface of the surface. Okay, our desires and passions are many and pull us in many directions. In fact, Augustine says, you made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless. And that's a restlessness there. There's an ache, a yearning, a longing inside of us where we feel all these things pulling us. But it's really within there that we see this desire for the infinite. And nothing that is finite, Augustine goes on to say, can fill that space that is really for the infinite. So we have to see, how do we help people interpret what is going on inside of them, and also understand the big picture of who we are, who God has made us to be, and human flourishing. Now, needed, therefore, is carving or shaping our desires and impulses, which leads to integration. This was called repression by Freud, but it's not. In fact, it requires hard work. It always requires hard work, because the essence of something unfolds in time and it moves towards its end. You don't see it in its beginning. It requires hard work. To not do that hard work is problematic. So, for instance, to not endure being carved and shaped well is unnatural. That's what's problematic. Our desires, our passions, all our impulses do need to be carved and shaped. We don't leave children in first year and say, well, you know, we're not teaching you anything because, you know, whatever you believe, whatever you feel, that's what it is. We don't. We teach them. So why do we do that in many other areas? But when it comes to sexuality, people become, and you have to ask yourself, that's where ideology begins to step in. And we step away from what is human nature. And here comes the quote I used at the beginning, that the best instance of the oak tree is really an oak tree that is fully flourishing. It's not an acorn, as beautiful as the acorn may be. The best instance of the human male is not when we're female of a person. Therefore, it's not a walking package of urges and desires, impulses, like animals that are out of control, horses in stables just waiting to burst out. No. Shaped and carved. And so we can ask, what does this learning process entail? This is just touching. I'm using the thoughts of Alistair McIntyre and St. Thomas Aquinas and 1 or 2 others here who have worked in the developmental area in anthropology especially. The child needs to learn, and each and every one of us has to ask, well, when did I learn that? Or do I offer this in my home? The child needs to learn to distinguish, especially from their parents, teachers, and caregivers. It's modeled. What do I want most from what is best for me to do? In other words, I may want, any child may say, oh God, I really want to eat the whole cake or the whole bucket of chicken, for instance. But what is best for me to do? And when we don't learn that at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, well, you get problems later on. You get problems in all sorts of ways. It is encounter with others that the distinction is applied before he or she is able to apply it to himself or herself. So when that's modeled, when that kind of temperance is modeled in the home, it helps. So such utterances as, stop eating that. I know you would like it, but it's bad for you. Or that's too much for you. Very important. This will hurt you, but you will not get well unless I do it. You know, the child may throw a tantrum and you have to say, this will hurt you now, but you have to learn that you've had enough. You've had enough of that social media. We're creating a society of addicts. You know, a psychologist who's a friend of mine was telling me, so concerned about that. In learning how to apply this distinction to himself or herself, so the second thing is that the child has to recognize a further distinction, that judgments that give expression to or report our wants and judgments about what is good or best for us. So they have to be able to distinguish in their own minds the way in which they are thinking and reasoning around judgments that give expression to our wants. So this is what I want, that's what I want. And because, why? Judgment says there's a why, a motive that we're able to identify, and judgments about what's good for us. So the question is, are our children, are we able, we can start with ourselves, are we able to articulate why do we want what we want? Sometimes people eating, drinking all kind of hours, and what they really need to do is sleep. You know, it's a misplaced need that they're attending to in another way because they can't sleep for one reason or another. And sometimes that happens to me. I have plenty of work to do, trying to finish this, that, or the other. And you know, you just say, oh gosh, for instance, I'm gonna eat this, but I don't really feel to eat this. You know, why am I eating this? We need to have the help of others here to have learn what is truly good for us. And this is so important because there's been an eclipse on what is good. The educational project, therefore, becomes developing our capacity as independent thinkers. So to flourish as members of our species, McIntyre says, is to make the transition from accepting what we were taught to independently thinking. This is good for me, not because mommy, daddy, auntie, so-and-so say it, or because I have a big stick over me. Because when we do that, we know what happens. Our kids go to university and they do whatever they want. And you know, or carnival pets, all sorts of things. Because we haven't taught them to choose what is good, to really choose what is good, okay? And to furnish reasons, that's the thing there, reasons why acting this way is better than acting in another way. And therefore, the educational event is that which leads us where a child becomes a parent, in other words, self-mastery, a sense of parenting myself, self-mastery. It's giving birth to the person. That's what the educational event is. And if we're talking sex education, if we're talking virtue formation, it has to lead to this sort of thing. So we have to understand what is really good. Because there are many things that we think are good, but because everything appears, when it says, Aristotle says, is that which all things aim. I want to eat the whole bucket of chicken, but it appears to be good, but is it really good? So he distinguishes between apparent goods and true goods. So when we're thinking through, wanting to do this, and what are the reasons for wanting to do this or that or the other, we have to begin talking about, okay, if this is best for me, what's the reason for that? And what is that truly good? Or is it just apparent? It's just looking good. So we have to learn, how do we teach our children? Move away from, moving from merely having reasons to being able to evaluate those reasons. Is this a good reason for this? And we have to, and that's why hearing, reading, talking, hearing the voice of so many people, it's important because as we bounce off, as we learn, we're informing our consciences. Step 2, transformation of the child's desires and passions. The child has to learn, for instance, in a chess game like that, child is playing and the granny, McIntyre uses this example, may say, if you play, you get a sweetie, or you get, parents bribe their children to do things, which there's a danger to that. And McIntyre says, yes, at first the granny may do that, but it comes a point where the child has to begin to understand, wait now, in playing this game, I'm gaining skills that are good for me, and I want to do this more than doing it for having a sweetie. How are we teaching our children to evaluate their passions and desires? We have to learn, teach them, stand back, recognize the goods present. Why am I doing this? This is not merely out of a need or a desire. And then the child has to learn how to therefore choose what is truly, truly good for them. Okay? I'm going to stop here because I know our time is running short. But this is just a quick view into, how do we, there's a lot there that needs to be spelled out, but it's how do we train children to choose what is good for them? What is really good, how to navigate their desires and integrate them towards their flourishing.
Thank you, Father. And so as we wrap up, we had that teaching about temperance or modesty. I just want to end quickly asking all of our panelists here, starting with maybe Kevin and Annette, to ask, well, as parents, what would you like to tell other parents about sex education and in this part about modesty in a world where modesty is not really realized? It's not popular.
No, it's not at all. And, it's something that it helps to protect yourself, right? From, not being viewed or looked at as something, as you spoke about, you're a human being. You are made in God's image and likeness. And modesty helps us to protect that, and of course, we want the best for our children. So it's always important for us, even as adults, to make sure that we understand why this would be important for our children going forward. So it has to start with us as parents and as adults.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that, the church has a lot of resources. I just want to encourage parents to reach out and we just really we can't stop learning. There's so much to learn. And then the children themselves, they're exposed to so many things that we need to keep on top of it and be able to reach them. So when we reach them, we could get the message and help them along their journey. So I think that is what we like to share.
Okay. And in less than a minute, Tanya.
Sorry. Okay. Well, just to wrap up, what went through those 4 points were the 4 cardinal virtues. I mean, I literally took them off as Father went through them. So again, for us as parents, as well as educators, is really to practice what we preach. If we really want our children to appreciate and understand, be it modesty, fortitude, self-discipline, we need to practice it ourselves. But coming from a parent's perspective, I have to say, I grew up with only sisters. My mother handed me a booklet to read. I had no, how should I put it, pre-education on how to be a parent in this aspect. And what I did was extensive reading and talking to older parents. And I still think that is a good place to begin. I did a lot of reading from Stenson and right now Canavox, Personal Identity, and of course, the website I gave you all, CATTT.com. Please, as parents, try to educate yourselves to have these conversations, but also remember, first and foremost, that children learn what they live.
Tanya and Jerome, what would you tell parents?
I just make it practical. Modesty is definitely part of sex ed. And as we're celebrating and shedding light on family and marriage, your family is like your first filter. That's your team. So, I mean, something simple as, you're going out, you leave in the house, your family could just check, like what you're wearing, something like, Jerome, I don't like that pants, maybe you should put that kind of pants a little too tight. Or boys will put on that jersey in your belly. Make it fun. Nothing to don't bring anybody down, but it's just, your family is your first check, they're your first defense, they're your first offense, right? So it's really to, every day, you don't ever get a time to set back. So make sure, you incorporate everyday activities into how you can live life more modestly, more chaste, more temperance.
Okay, and so I thank Father Matthew, Kevin and Annette Downs, Tanya Gooding, and Jerome Alexander. And I am Pauline Phelps, and we thank you for joining us this evening. God bless.
We are a family.